Britain decided to turn the problem of Palestine over to the United Nations. The UN, under pressure, proposed to divide the land into two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state. Arabs were to be given 43% of the land, despite the fact that they made up more than 2/3 of the population and owned over 92% of the land. Jews were to be given 56%, although they comprised only 1/3 of the population and owned less than 8% of the total area.
Nevertheless, they were given not only most of the land, they were given the most fertile land.
Zionist leaders took advantage of their superior military preparation and immediately began occupying major Arab cities in Palestine.
I was among the people that conquered Akko. When we were walking around, we entered a flat. There was a pair of shoes of a small child, maybe 2 years old. They didn't have time to put on the shoes, so they left the shoes and they ran away. They left everything.
We found out that there was a systematic expulsion of Palestinians, and there was, as I said, there was an ethnic cleansing operation taking place.
The most infamous campaign was the massacre at the village of Deir Yassin, where over 100 men, women, and children were systematically murdered.
هذا البيت ما كان متخبيين فيه أنا وولادي وأخويا موسى. ما كان لي أنا معد أخوي موسى مشان كان نتونس بالله فيه. هذا البيت. أجوا قالوا لما كنا بالبيت كنا مش كسر خبطنا الكنبلة وجينا صوبتنا وبنت الصوابت اللي مسحوا ولادي. وكان بعد ما راحت المراكة الحالة كانت كسروا الباب عليهم وطلعونا. بدهم يقتلوا أخوي مسدبة فيه على وجهه اللي يقتلوه. وتناولت 250 ليرة من عدة. وقلت يا خواجه بس مشان الله الطالب بدها قلت ليش؟ قال لي كثير انت كويس. هات المصاري وبعدين شو اخوتي الحنو شو تسوي في اخوتي الحنو؟ اجراك يا ويلي هي زبطتك على السلام. تحلي. وجدت اليهود حط لك خمس زيت ويكون راسك في موسك الدم. حط لك 5 مليون تحت راسك.
The ruthlessness of the attack on Deir Yassin drove fear and panic into the Palestinian population and led to the flight of unarmed civilians from their homes all over the country.
As a result, maybe 300 or so thousand Palestinians had already been expelled before the first Arab soldier entered Palestine.
Some of the neighboring Arab armies finally intervened after May 15, 1948, when Israel officially announced its statehood.
Although there was a lot of war rhetoric on the Arab side, very few soldiers, Arab soldiers, were sent into the battlefield. And actually, for most parts of the war, there was a superiority on the side of the Israeli army.
The Israeli army cleansed much of the territory and took over a large part of the designated Palestinian state.
The new state of Israel encompassed 78% of the total land of Palestine. The West Bank came under Jordanian control and the Gaza Strip under Egyptian dominion. Although a truce was declared between Israel and the Arab states, true peace remained elusive, as over 700,000 Palestinian refugees languished in nearby camps, often in sight of homes to which they still held the deeds and a deep desire to return.
Most of the deserted and evicted Palestinian villages were erased from upon the earth and were either turned into Jewish settlements or into fertile land.
Of the 500 Palestinian villages in what became Israel in 1948, 400 were destroyed.
These efforts to destroy the possibility of their returning home were countered by the United Nations, which continues to affirm their human right enshrined in international law and morality to return.
A Palestinian who had lost her land or lost his land as the result of the creation of Israel in 1948 cannot come back even for a visit. I can go back to Israel as if I were returning and claim immediate citizenship, having no historic tie, speaking no Hebrew, knowing no one in the country, having no family who ever was there. All that one needs is being Jewish, a religious group like any other.
I'm a witness. I know the Arabs are very good. No problem till the Zionist movement start. My grandmother told me before the Zionist movement start, they babysitting each other, the kids. They bar offen watch each other like brothers, like brothers. The idea of Zionism to take away the land from the Palestinians, from the Arabs, is starting the whole fighting. Not Arabs the problem, not Jews the problem, not Judaism, not Muslim, only Zionism.
The events of 1948 were a defining moment for the Middle East, and from that point onward created instability throughout the region. Violent tensions continued and led to another war in 1967. In that war, Israel occupied the remainder of historic Palestine, what is known today as the West Bank and Gaza.
Another myth was that Israel was about to be pushed into the sea, but I was working in the State Department at that time. There was no question of Israel being pushed into the sea. The question was just the rapidity and the totalness of the Israeli victory, and the victory was crushing.
During the 1967 war, Israel displaced more than 400,000 Palestinians, half of whom were 1948 refugees, displaced for a second time in less than 2 decades. It became clear that the world was not going to address their plight. Palestinians in Israel lived as third-class citizens of a state whose core identity excluded them, while those in the newly occupied territories and abroad continued as dispossessed refugees. The United Nations passed resolution after resolution affirming their rights. Leaders of surrounding Arab nations verbally championed their cause, but failed to take action. Finally, Palestinians took matters into their own hands. There was a mass uprising, in Arabic an intifada, shaking off, as people throughout the West Bank and Gaza Strip rebelled. The Israeli government adopted a strategy, in the words of Defense Minister Itzhak Rabin, of might, power, and beatings, which became known as the break the bones strategy. Thousands of Palestinians were rounded up and imprisoned. Since 1967, over 400,000. Many were held without any charges whatsoever, under harsh conditions where physical abuse and torture were rampant.
Today, we bear witness to an extraordinary act in one of history's defining dramas.
The Oslo process begins officially with the handshake on the White House lawn.
I think of the main misconceptions that the years of Oslo were years of peace.
And in that period, when there was supposed to be a peace process underway, in fact, the daily lives of Palestinians throughout the occupied territories got worse and worse and worse.
The reality, and I saw it with my own eyes, that this was a new form of Israeli domination over Palestinians.
Economic and social rights, which are rights to health, education, work, etc. These areas are the areas that declined the worst for the majority of Palestinians, almost all Palestinians.
All the economic indicators turned for the worse under Oslo during this peace process.
Moreover, Israeli settlements have continued to expand throughout that period.
At the same time that Israeli control was expanding, the Palestinian Authority was given the trappings of power over the shrinking and non-contiguous Palestinian land, being held out as a future Palestinian state.
The challenges of governing for the Palestine Authority are extraordinarily complex. This is an authority that has very little authority. It has virtually no power. Its power is derivative. It has the power that is given to it by Israel, and at any moment, any of those powers can be taken away.
It was very convenient to believe that there is no occupation, that the occupation is over. How many aspects in your life somebody else determines for you? This is occupation. And Israel could determine, in the last 10 years, could determine everything. But everybody heard Arafat saying 10 times to 100 times that Ramallah is liberated and Gaza is liberated. How can it be liberated if there is an army around it? The Palestinian officials spoke very warmly about the situation, about the reality, and they were hiding the fact that for the great majority of the population, these years were a disaster.
Those abuses, those violations of the public trust have been happening regularly since the Oslo process began.
Palestinians who would protest against Oslo were labeled as terrorists. The authority would not allow it, the PA.
Instead of having a real national authority, you had this corrupt institution whose main task, as far as Israel is concerned, was to police the Palestinians and prevent them from resisting the continuing occupation.
It has wasted a lot of the money the international community has given it. One sees the villas of the leading Palestinian officials and the poverty with which the Palestinian masses are living in.
The performance of the PLO in running the Palestinian Authority and its failures in negotiating with Israel have very much diminished support for the PLO leadership.
While Americans were being told by the media that a peace process was moving forward, Israel continued its policy of home demolitions. Since 1967, about 12,000 Palestinian homes have been demolished. More than 700 of those homes were demolished during the Oslo peace process.
What you've got to have, and I think it's a fair demand on the part of Palestinians, that during the process of negotiation, you're not turning over more and more territory to Israeli settlers and changing the character of the land that you're supposed to be negotiating about.
The notion that this is going to be a negotiable question does not ring true to any Palestinian who lives up against one of these settlements, which are continually expanding. And what does it mean to expand? It means you steal more land.
Abdul Jawad is a Palestinian farmer whose family has lived there and tended the land for centuries. The Israeli authorities have confiscated countless acres of their farmland.
شوف الشجر اللي كان ما أحلى اللي كان موجود هون. يعني كيف واحد بقعد في جنة أنا مسوي جنة هون. شوف شو بدال الجنة شوف شو سووا معاي. شوف شو هلأ بتتفرج شو هذا اللي سووه هون. شوف الأشجار كيف بيطلعوا من تحت الحجار، شايف كيف؟ يطلع الأشجار من تحت الحجار. مش حرام هذا يبقى بدل ما يقعد بني آدم اللي بيقول الله، مش حرام هذا يقعد بداله حجر زي هذا؟ هذه معيشتنا، لا إنا لا برا ولا بحرا ولا جو، هذه المعيشة تاعنا، وبنستنى لطف الله. شو نعمل؟
These settlers live and prosper at the expense of the Palestinians and the Palestinians' well-being, present well-being, and future well-being.
And they don't see this horrible, disproportionate allocation of resources where Jewish settlers get water and electricity and gas, garbage pickup, all kinds of things that their Palestinian neighbors don't get because of the military occupation.
هذيك المنطقة منطقة بين نعيم ممنوعة تيجي علينا. هذول الدور شوف يعني في واحد شوف يعني واحد بحوث في قلب الدور من العرب ولا واحد بحوث من العرب موجود هناك. هذه السيارة يعني لو ما إسرائيلية بعدوهاش.
They lost the middle of the valley for a bypass road, which is now an Israeli-only bypass road. They can't drive on it to go to their homes.
The thing is extremely ugly to watch. I mean, this is just day-to-day life. I'm not talking about the fighting here. I mean, you walk through Hebron, it's an Arab city, 100,000 Arabs, a couple hundred Jews. Settlers walking around with rifles, looking as if they own the place.
Settlers can go in a Palestinian village and burn the fields there, destroy the house, hit Palestinian, even shoot Palestinian.
Several of the women have been beaten by settlers on different occasions. In each of those cases, we were just being a nonviolent presence on the street, observing when settlers were acting out. And they just attacked different ones of us.
والله يا عمي قد ما نحكي لكم جزء من اللي بنشوفه.
The Israeli government is not doing anything to try and stop the settlers from violating Palestinian rights. From all the cases that settlers actually killed Palestinians, very few were accused of murders, but then the president came and gave amnesty or shortened the punishment that they received from the court. In some cases, they cooperate with them, they guard them. Like one case, the settlers went and took a house, Palestinian house, and just said, well, now it's ours. So the border police stood down there to protect them because the Palestinians were angry. So the border police just stood there and protected the settlers instead of course, arresting them, just saying it's illegal.
The bottom line is to make things so difficult for the Palestinians that anybody that wants a future for their children, anybody that wants to get ahead in life, anybody that wants a normal life will leave.
يعني أنو اللي عنده جنة زي هذه ويعني بده يرحل وبده يروح ويرحل ويدشرها. وين بدنا نروح احنا وندشر أرضنا اللي زي هذه؟
The Jabr family continues to live under constant harassment. Most recently, Abdul Jawad broke his leg while trying to protect his grandchildren from settler attacks.
Many of us feel hostage, that we're held hostage to the settlers. Because I think the vast majority of Israelis don't care about the occupied territories. But we're held hostage to the settlers that have enough political power within the Israeli political system that they can frustrate any attempt to get them out. And as long as they're there, the Palestinians can't possibly make peace.
There are two kinds of settlers, basically. There are the ideological settlers who feel that these territories have been promised to the Jewish people by God, and they feel that every place which is mentioned in the Bible, they have not only the right but the sacred duty to come and to build a modern Jewish settlement. And if Palestinians who live on that spot have other ideas, then they have the right to break their resistance by force or to call in the army. And the other kind, which are the more majority of the settlers are in fact ordinary Israelis who came there simply because the government was offering them very cheap housing. When you go to live there, then most of the money you get is a government loan, and if you stay there for 10 years, then you don't have to pay back the loan.
Well, I think the unpleasant and unavoidable comparison is with South Africa during the apartheid period. And I must say that having visited South Africa, that they were much better off than the Palestinians living in the refugee camps.